and welcome back to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, the platinum-selling singer Kate Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, and the woman aiming to be the first female president of Afghanistan. But we begin with a nation, but not yet a nation-state. Not Palestine we're talking about, or not Tibet, but we're talking about Scotland. Its population of a bit over 5 million is less than 10% of the rest of the UK, but the lucrative North Sea oil and gas fields are all located off the Scottish coast. And many Scots now want to leave the UK, but whether it's enough to win a referendum is another matter. The movement for Scottish independence has been led by the Scottish National Party's leader, Alex Salmond, once an outsider, now Scotland's First Minister. There'll be a referendum in 2014 and he's already campaigning, as I discovered when we met up in the middle of the week. Alex, it's great to have you with us. Let's start with the simple question that people would love to know. Would you still be pushing hard for Scottish independence if somebody convinced you that economically Scotland could be worse off? If they could, would you still go for independence?
Well, luckily I don't have that dilemma. I mean, I think the case for independence is a fundamental one. It's about Scotland as a nation, and nations have a right to self-determination, but usually are better to govern themselves as opposed to let someone else do it for them. But secondly, I mean, I believe that independence will be good for the Scottish economy, good for the Scottish people. So I don't have that dilemma. Right. But the fundamental case for independence is based on Scotland being a nation and national self-determination.
But in terms of things like, you've pointed to countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark as your role models in a way. But now that you've got two countries, small countries in severe trouble, Greece and Ireland, for instance, does that pull you up to a full stop to think again whether small countries like yours can function successfully in the new world?
Or we could say that big countries like Spain and Italy are having trouble. I think the lesson of the international financial crisis is it's affected countries large and small. There's no suggestion, at least there's no figures that indicate that small countries have been particularly badly affected, or that big countries have been insulated from the economic blast. I mean, I think the lesson is that a country will tend to prosper if it pursues wise economic policies and harnesses its resources to the talents of its people. So countries large and small can prosper, but certainly Scotland would become an independent country with huge advantages. A natural resource base unrivaled in the European continent, with the sole exception of Norway, and a skilled and talented and educated population. 5 universities in the world's top 200, for example. What do you
think the figure of debt to England and so on will be? They say 80 billion.
Well, if Scotland became independent now or last year, then we'd have a debt to GDP ratio of 66%, which is high. But the UK is 76%. The European Union average is over 80%, and the G7 average is 110%. So we'd have a substantial debt that we'd inherit, a per capita debt, a share. But compared to our GDP, it will be less than many other countries at the present moment. Of course, what really matters about debt, as Moody's reminded us just this week, is whether you have a growth strategy for the economy, because you'll never, ever solve a debt problem unless you've got a growth performance.
And what about the deal finally on North Sea oil and gas? How will it finally, do you think, be divided up?
Well, it'll be the Geneva Convention, it'll be the geographical share, it'll be towards international law. It'll be one of the big pluses for an independent Scotland. It'll give us a £1 trillion asset. On the other hand, there are liabilities as well. We'll have to take our population share of the accumulated UK national debt. So there are pros and cons in all these matters, but certainly the resource base of Scotland will be one of the big positives.
You've talked often about how Scotland will be better off if it's independent and so on. But how do you respond when you hear people saying, well, no, there'll be a black hole of at least 12 billion and so on? How do you deal with those?
Well, it's interesting. I think that debate on, let's call it the balance sheet examination, is kind of moving in our favour. I noticed the Centre for Economic and Business, a London-based research centre, hasn't always been the friendliest towards Scottish independence, incidentally, but in a report in the Sunday Times at the weekend concluded that Scotland was not a net beneficiary of the United Kingdom Treasury, because our additional revenue more than balances the spending requirement. And if you look at the official statistics, the government expenditure and revenue report for the last 5 years, then we'd have been cumulatively about £7.2 billion better off in that 5-year period. So we'd start from a good position, a strong position, stronger than elsewhere. But a country's wealth and its progress depends on the wisdom of economic policy and on the talents and abilities of its people. These are the things that matter. And what actually matters in economics is where you're going. Do you have a growth strategy? You're going to grow the economy. It's the invention of an innovation in the economy, harnessed to a wise economic policy. So our basic proposition is that Scotland as a whole, and the Scottish economy in particular, would be better run by the people who live in Scotland than by people who don't.
And what about the ratings agency saying that Scotland, because it would be small and very much on its own, would not retain a AAA rating?
Well, I actually saw that report in the FT, and if you read the report, as I know you do, David, carefully, you'll find it wasn't actually based on anything the rating agencies said. It was based on one anonymous analyst. Now, I would argue two things. One, that Scotland's position would be strong, because although we have a high debt to GDP ratio, it's less than the UK's, less than the European Union's, and less than the G7 average at the present moment. But secondly, and crucially, as far as a ratings agency is concerned, Scotland also has a huge natural asset, a £1 trillion asset, to a population of 5.25 million. That puts us in a very strong position in terms of what's assessed in rating agencies. But of course, as we've seen in the last few days, people like the Chancellor, who complacently assumed that the UK's AAA status was secure for all time, have had their comeuppance.
And if you were to lose the battle for independence, that the Scottish people were to vote it out or something, would that be the end of your political career? Would you step down, or would you fight on?
Well, I'm aiming to emulate yourself, David. Well, you've asked me many, many times over the years, hypothetical questions. I've always said to you, look, let's hypothesize on success rather than failure, and I always do. But can I just say this? In my early political career, when you interviewed me, people said, there'll never be a Scottish Parliament. Well, now there is a Scottish Parliament. It's been there for 12 years or so. Then people said, oh, well, the SNP will never win in the Parliament. And then the SNP became a minority government. And then when we became a minority government, the same people said, well, they'll never win another election. Now we're a majority government in a proportional system. So when the same people tell me Scotland's not going to be an independent country, I sort of think about, well, they were wrong about the Parliament, they were wrong about the election. Why should they be right about the independence referendum? I think we'll win the independence referendum, and we'll win it because we'll win an argument for the future of our country.
But will you also be able to refinance Rangers, though?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it's a really interesting question, this, because obviously the HMRC, the revenue, have got to pursue, in terms of the public interest, proper taxation. Equally, they've got to have cognizance of the fact that we're talking here about a huge institution, the very fabric of the Scottish nation, as well as Scottish football. And everybody realises that. The most die-hard Celtic supporter understands that Celtic can't prosper unless Rangers are there. The rest of the clubs understand that as well. And therefore, you have to have cognizance of these things when you're pursuing public policy. And we've certainly been arguing to the HMRC on the one hand, and indeed to Rangers on the other, for goodness sake, get a settlement. Get a settlement and a structure over time whereby Rangers can continue, because Rangers must continue for the future of Scottish football and for the fabric of the country.
Right, up the Rangers, yes. And Celtic, you must be fair to both sides.
I have to mention Hearts as well, because I support
Hearts,
and Aberdeen, because it's my constituency.
Right. Hey, it's 2.5 years now since your administration freed Mr. McGrahey, and he was going to survive for only 3 months, and it's now 2.5 years and so on. I mean, is there a case for bringing him back to Scotland to finish his jail term?
None whatsoever.
Why not?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody seriously argues that this man is not a dying man. I mean, we've seen visible evidence in Al Jazeera, of course, and elsewhere, of that. Nobody seriously contests the fact that he's dying of terminal prostate cancer, and I think he should be allowed to die in peace. You know, everything we did in this issue, we did in terms of Scots law. We applied the same strictures of Scots law as we would have applied to any other prisoner under the same circumstances. We had no thought to international politics or oil deals or the rest of it. Of course, we now know that that dominated the thinking of the then United Kingdom government. We know that because the Cabinet Secretary has reported on it. But every single report, whether from the Cabinet Secretary, even the United States Senators, found no evidence whatsoever that the Scottish Government had done anything other than act on the precepts and principles of Scots law. And on the same principles, this is a prisoner under licence. He hasn't broken his licence conditions. I think he should be left to die in peace.
Summing up, a paragraph on each. What would Scotland, summing up, get out of it? And what, if anything, would the rest of the UK get out of it?
Well, let's talk about the rest of the UK first. I think relationships would improve between Scotland and the other nations in these islands. I think between Scotland and England in particular. Why? Because a lot of folk in England think that Scotland gets too much in public spending. Now, the best way to resolve that is to have both countries raising their own taxes, governing their own revenue, standing on their own 2 feet. That makes for a better relationship of quality. So we'll continue to be the best of neighbours, the best of friends with all of the other countries in these islands. But we're also determined to be good world citizens. We want to be fully participating in the European Union and in the international community. What Scotland gets out of it, Scotland gets a prosperous economy and a just society and the ability to determine and to imagine our own future.
Thank you very much. And the Queen stays as Queen of Scotland?
She does. Queen Elizabeth, Queen of Scots. The historic title,
yes.
Elizabeth, Queen of Scots.
Yes, yes.
Not of the land, but of the people.
Thank you very much, Alex.
A great pleasure, David.
President Obama recently hailed the latest employment figures for the US as seemingly positive. But although the US does look like it's heading in the right direction out of the financial crisis, is it really? And how sustainable is this supposed recovery? With the Eurozone looking ever more bleak, how will it impact any US economic growth? Well, one man who can certainly help us connect almost all of those dots is the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman. He's the renowned author of, and editor of indeed too, over 20 books and 200 academic papers in professional journals. Professor Krugman, welcome. Professor, the latest figures on unemployment in the United States are positive. I mean, is that sustainable?
Possibly. You know, even pessimists like myself don't think that that slumps go on forever. There are some natural healing forces. There's some reason to think things may be on an uptrend, but you know, it's very slow. If you actually take these numbers that we've seen and ask how long before we're at something that feels like full employment, the answer is maybe the year 2019 or so. So we're on an upward slope, but a slow upward slope.
A slow upward slope. And someone was saying the other day, why are we repeating all the age-old debate of Keynes and Hayek, stimulus versus spending? Don't we need a new debate to deal with today's economic realities? Do we need a new debate or more of the old debate?
Well, I'm surprised that we're having this old debate. I thought it had been settled in Keynes's favor, but it turns out that, I think largely for political reasons, people have never been willing to accept the verdict of the evidence. And no, it's actually very important that the rules of economics change very slowly. What we're going through is very recognizably a close cousin of what happened in the 1930s. This is not something totally different from what we've seen before. It's actually all too similar to what we've seen before. As some of my friends say, it turns out that the way to get new economic ideas is to read old books, because we're actually going through many of the same things. And the reason that we're having this old debate is basically because the losing side of that debate has refused to accept no for an answer. So
this we're facing at the moment, or been facing, is a debt crisis or a currency crisis, or both?
Oh, I don't think it's a currency crisis at all. It's not a actually, what's been quite remarkable is how little of that kind of thing we've had. We've not had a problem of a collapsing pound or a collapsing dollar or a collapsing euro for that matter. It is in large part a debt crisis, but it's primarily, though this is not the way people like to talk about it, it's primarily a private debt crisis. It's the overhang of private debt that was built up during the bubble years, both sides of the Atlantic, that is the big source of our continuing depressed economic state.
And what effect is what's happening in Europe, in particular to do with the Eurozone and so on, what effect will that have, is that having on economic life in Wall Street, in the US? I mean, how much is that contagious?
Well, that's an interesting debate we're having now. It's a and it's a real question. If you ask about the direct spillover from Europe's difficulties to the U.S. via exports, it's a lot smaller than people think. You know, even in this age of globalization, the United States sells about 2.5% of what it makes to Europe. So it's actually not a big thing. What we're all worried about is the financial contagion. You know, is this going to be like the fall of Lehman Brothers in 2008? I guess I'm becoming more optimistic that will be contained. So I think actually the impact of Europe's difficulties on the United States is going to be smaller than a lot of people have been imagining.
So does that put you in general in an optimistic frame of mind about the next 5 years or not?
Wow, 5 years, I think I'm modestly optimistic about 5 years. I think if we're looking 5 years ahead, a lot of that overhang of debt will either have been paid off or defaulted on, so it will go away. There will be a backlog of technologies that haven't been exploited that companies will want to invest in. So give me 5 years from now and we will probably have had a recovery. But I'm much less optimistic about the next 2 years where lots of things can go wrong. And of course that has political, social spillovers. You know, we can still do ourselves an enormous amount of damage if we don't deal with this problem now instead of just waiting for it to slowly heal.
And so should there be less or more emphasis on that magic noun, austerity?
Well, much less. I mean, the logic was always poor. The argument was that you're going to create confidence by slashing government spending, even though you're also destroying jobs, destroying demand when you do so. And of course, the confidence never comes because even investors, they don't think about what's the budget going to be over the next 10 years. They think about what's going to happen to my sales this year. And so it hasn't worked as an expansionary policy. And it's not even very effective on terms of reducing debt burdens, because although you spend less, you also shrink the economy, which means you have less revenue. You hurt the economy's long-run prospects, which means you can expect less revenue in the future. It's not at all clear that all this austerity is doing any good, even on the purely fiscal front, while it's at the same time inflicting a lot of damage on economies and on people's lives.
So it's having a doubly negative effect in a way.
Yeah, I think we've actually certainly the Cameron government in the UK, and to a large extent, I would say the governments of continental Europe have managed to find their way to a lose-lose policy, something which makes them worse off on all fronts. And the trouble is that their response, when the numbers don't come in the way they should, is even more. So it's really become like medieval doctors who bleed their patients, and then when the patients get sick from the bleeding, they bleed them some more.
Yeah. Exactly, yes. And you were quoted recently as saying Europe is already in a new Great Depression, so that you're much less confident about Europe than as you just were about the United States, really.
Well, I mean, I think of essentially the whole Western world as being in a depression, which doesn't mean that everything is always plunging. You know, most of the time, actually, economies were growing more years than not during the Great Depression, but they were depressed the whole way. It's not as bad as the Great Depression, but it's worse than anything except the Great Depression. And Europe substantial parts of Europe are actually at depression levels of distress. Spain with 23% unemployment, Greece where just the whole fabric of life is collapsing. So this is, you know, you can say this is not 1933, but it's certainly worse than anything else we've seen since then.
And therefore, in that situation where not enough is being done and its figures 23% there and so on and so forth, are there ways in which the European governments or the Euro Union should be doing something more to deal with this situation? Is everything being done right about it or not?
Oh, no. I mean, if I were going to ask what it would take to save the euro, because I don't think on the current course it's going to work, you need the stronger European countries to be doing stimulus, not austerity. So the Germans should not be tightening their belts right now. They should be doing the opposite. You need the European Central Bank to be doing more or less what the Bank of England is doing, and doing lots and lots of aggressive stuff to try and expand the economy. The only way that they have a realistic hope of making this thing work is if the general European economy is perking along strongly enough that countries like Spain or Greece have a reasonable chance of exporting their way back to a decent economic situation.
We were talking the other day to Dominique de Villepin, who was in a very articulate form, and he said last week one thing in particular he emphasized, that in terms of dealing with the current situation economically, there was, and I quote, a serious lack of imagination over policies dealing with the Eurozone. That is what's lacking, imagination. Is imagination that valuable, and is it lacking?
I mean, I'm actually not too sympathetic to that remark, because I think that the problems that we face are not exotic. They're not something that has never been seen before. On the contrary, they're things that we've seen many times over the course of history. What we need is almost what we need is a willingness to believe the economics textbooks. I mean, what's actually been happening in Europe, especially, although to some extent in the U.S. as well, is that policymakers have made up their own version of economics. They've decided to believe that it's all about morality, and if only everybody buckles down and suffers enough, everything will be fine. And that's very imaginative on their part. It unfortunately turns out to be very destructive as well. So there's nothing. There's nothing Europe should be doing that is not more or less implied by Paul Samuelson's classic 1948 textbook in economics. It's just maybe what you need is the political imagination to understand that Europe doesn't have to treat this all as a great morality play, that it needs to actually say, okay, what is the problem, how can we solve it, not who was at fault.
That's very clear. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor.
Well, thank you.
The delightful and talented singer-songwriter Kate Nash will be with me next after this short break.